everybody? Welcome to another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, and not just any kind of fantasy. I'm talking Kingkiller Chronicles fantasy by none other than the legendary Patrick Rothfuss.
Yeah, this is one of our favorite series on the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. We've loved chatting about it ever since I first pitched it to you in our first ever Friends Pitching Fantasy episode.
That's right.
And
second series we ever read on the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast, and we just can't quit it, for only 2 works in the series, 2.5 maybe if you count Slow Regard. We just need to find ways to keep the conversation going because it's a series that just sticks with us, and we know you guys like us talking about Kingkiller. They're definitely some of my more popular episodes, and we couldn't be more thrilled because there's so much to talk about. Those episodes, we felt like we had to talk about everything back in those days. It's like, okay, we have and those episodes were an hour and a half long, and it's like, you know what? Nothing's stopping us from continuing to talk about Kingkiller and over.
We had no idea what we were doing back then, Charles. Now we have a little bit of an idea, still not very much, I feel, but
still working it out.
Enough to say it's okay to talk about Kingkiller more than just in our Buddy Read episode. So we're excited to do that today with a discussion about, is Kvothe a Mary Sue?
Ooh, this is a hot button issue in the Kingkiller criticism world, and it's one that we talked about and touched on in our Kingkiller Buddy Read episodes. So definitely go and check those out. But it's a question that we're really trying to get to the heart of today. We've been kind of fascinated about this idea of a Mary Sue. Dylan and I have been doing a lot of research into the topic. We have lots of thoughts about it, and we plan on doing a more in-depth discussion of just the phrase Mary Sue in our next episode. But we couldn't talk about that before one of fantasy's more popular Mary Sues, Kvothe himself.
Or alleged Mary Sue's, Charles.
That's right. So, yes. I'll kind of... Dylan, as our resident Kingkiller lore master, will kind of kick us off.
Well, I think that the best place to start in this conversation is to introduce the term Mary Sue. It's obviously one that's thrown around a lot in fantasy communities, but some people might not know what it means.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, even after all of my research into it, I don't think I really know what it means, which we'll get into more of that probably in our Mary Sue focused episode that you teased there.
Yeah.
But Charles, shall we start by seeing what kind of definitions we came up with about Mary Sue?
Yeah.
What is a Mary Sue, Charles?
Well, I have one just that I generically pulled up from Wikipedia that says a Mary Sue is a generic name for any fictional character, and then in parentheses it says usually female, who is so competent or perfect that this appears unrealistic for the world's setting, even in the context of the fictional setting. It goes on, but I think that's a good place to start. And for me, the important distinction there is that it appears unrealistic for the world's setting, right? It's not earned. Like they're good at something without having trained for it or without having the background in it or whatever. It's like this unearned, all of a sudden, top tier ability that they have achieved that kind of breaks the storyline for me. And that's the important distinction for me of what's a Mary Sue. It's like a plot breaking. It's like, oh, didn't need to train for that at all. Just happened to be an expert at it kind of thing.
That is totally fair, Charles. I like you pointing out that bit about it being potentially unearned. I grabbed a lot of my definition from TV tropes. I'm sure a lot of folks are familiar with that. Yeah, they've probably, if they're like me, they've probably gone down the rabbit hole and spend way too much time on there once they get started. So that's a great website, and they were reticent about giving a real definition for Mary Sue, given how broad it is, but they pointed out a few things that tend to come up when people talk about Mary Sue's. And they were saying that oftentimes it involves being, they said, irrelevantly overskilled or over idealized. And I think that fits well with your point, Charles, where it's like, okay, is this stuff that is relevant or germane to the story and what we're trying to tell about this character, or is it just this, they said, oftentimes self-insert feeling character, or meaning the author is trying to write some sort of idealized version of themselves in
Right.
the book. And oftentimes other things that come up are that the character is flawless, or their only flaws are actually likable things. It's like in job interviews where you say, well, my greatest weakness is that I am too dedicated to my work and things like that. So not real flaws. And then the other thing is like everyone loves them or is attracted to them for seemingly no reason. So those things came up
Yeah,
a lot.
those are good distinctions as well, especially as we get into Kvothe himself. So how do you want to take this in terms of like how do we break down all the kind of accusations against Kvothe being a Mary Sue and how we feel about those allegations and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's best for us to just frame as we usually do in our. This is us having a conversation between friends about do we think Kvothe is a Mary Sue based on what we've come up with. We're not trying to be the final word or anything like
Right.
that, or really going strong with our takes. So I think maybe we could just talk about some of these things that we've raised already about what a Mary Sue can be
Mm-hmm.
and see, does Kvothe fall into those categories based on our experience of reading the Kingkiller Chronicle? How's that sound, Charles?
Sounds great to me. Yeah, like you said, we're just two friends talking fantasy. There's as we go through this, I mean, I think you'll find out that is Kvothe Mary Sue. We're leaning towards not really, but the argument there's a very strong argument to be made that he is, and that's kind of the nuance that we're going to get into in this. But we're not here to argue. We're just kind of here as enthusiasts of the fantasy genre and of King Killers and of the idea of a Mary Sue just at all to kind of get into a more nuanced conversation about Kvothe. And that's why we're here. So, yeah, Dylan, I'll leave it to you to kind of bring up our first point here.
For sure. Well, I want to dive deeper into the piece we were talking about regarding, is it unrealistic for the world and what's going on around Kvothe, as well as this piece about, is it irrelevant
Right.
to the story?
Right.
So I have some thoughts on that,
Let's
Charles,
hear it.
that I think that uh, a big thing that comes up for me is differentiating between the frame story, where Kvothe has become Kote and is telling a story about himself when he was Kvothe, this legendary figure.
Mm-hmm.
And I see the frame story as providing us with the knowledge that this is a tragedy, that this is going to end really poorly for Kvothe, despite all of these great qualities that Kvothe holds. And in that sense, I feel like it is relevant and helpful to know how incredible Kvothe is at all of these different things, because they say the bigger you are, the harder you fall. I
Right.
think that if you're trying to create a character where his fall from grace is going to be really interesting and entertaining, you have to give him the grace to fall from. And
Sure.
that's a big part for me of what makes Kvothe's greatness in all of these ways relevant to the story. And
Absolutely. I think you did. I think it's a good idea to start with this point of like, look, there's the frame story, and then there's the story that is being told. And I think it's really important from wherever we go from here to keep in mind of the context of this fictional setting. Okay, the context is you have a man, Kvothe, who is clearly like as self-described waiting to die, defeated man, and then the bulk of the story, 99% of everything that we see from Kvothe, is a story being told by Kvothe. So there's already a biased lens that we tend to forget about because it's such a large portion of the book. But this is a story that's being told, and that context is super important when you think about his accomplishments and how he is perceived by others and everything like that. Because this is a man telling a story about himself. He's telling his life story, and he's a storyteller. He comes from a family of performers, and it's like, look, no story is true without a little bit of lies and embellishments and entertainment aspect of it. That's said right in the beginning of the book. So you have to keep in mind the perspective and the context here of the whole story of Kingkiller.
He quotes Scarpi, who is a legendary storyteller in Kvothe's story, as saying, you have to be a bit of a liar to tell a story the right way. And I think Kvothe,
Yes.
as someone who comes from performers and was influenced by someone like Scarpi, takes that very seriously. So I think a lot of the reason that people call characters Mary Sue's, like we said, is this idea of a self-insert character.
Right.
And it's an interesting one to think about with Kingkiller, because the reasons why Kvothe is getting labeled a Mary Sue a lot are much more about the things he's doing in the story within the story, meaning the story being told by Kvothe, not what he's doing in the frame story as Kvothe, which means that Kvothe actually is a self-insert from Kvothe.
Yes.
I don't necessarily think from Rothfuss, but I don't know what Rothfuss was or wasn't thinking. I'm not him. But I'll say the things that Kvothe is doing in the vast majority of why he's being called a Mary Sue are pretty explicitly the ways that Kvothe is retelling his tale to shape the narrative to make himself look exactly like he wants to look. In fact, Kvothe basically tells Chronicler, who's taking down the story, that he'll only convey the story if Chronicler takes down every single word in the way that Kvothe said it. So we know that Kvothe has a tendency to be not necessarily completely reliable based on some of the things that he's done in the past and some of the things he's said. And we also know that he cares a lot about controlling the way that he is perceived. So to me, the relevance bit is part of the story of the Kingkiller Chronicle is about how does Kvothe choose to portray himself, and how much of it do we believe is true? And these speculations about is Kvothe a Mary Sue, is he not, I think are all part of it, and I think they're deliberate, intentional, and relevant on the part of Rothfuss's work here.
For all you friends at home that can't see, I'm nodding my head enthusiastically the whole time. That's exceptionally well said, because we have what makes this story so good is Rothfuss is not the kind of author who will repeat themes or have ominous things or whatever beyond stating the fact. He's committed to this idea that Kvothe is the narrator telling a story, and he's committed to telling the story in the way Kvothe would tell it, and he's not giving us that omniscient, like, oh, I might be lying about certain things. It's just straight out like, you have to write the story exactly how I say it. And in that story, I'm telling you how I've learned to tell stories is by embellishing it. And Rothfuss kind of lays that out for you, not in such a blatantly obvious way, but in an ever-present way, an ever-honest way to Kvothe. And I think that commitment and that nuance can easily get kind of confused and lost when you see what Kvothe in the actual story gets up to, and you're like eye rolling, like, oh, he happens to be the best musician in the room just by getting up there. Everyone loves him all of a sudden. It's like, well, think about everything that happened up to that point, and think about who's like we're still being told a story here. Think about who's telling it.
Hmm.
Like all those aspects come in. They're very subtle. They're very nuanced, but they make it so rich, and they make like where's the story going to go that much more exceptional.
For sure, Charles. And I think it's okay if you're a reader who doesn't like hearing this story because the quote within a story is too good at things. You're allowed to
For
not like
sure.
that. It just makes me feel that the relevance is there for why Quoth is so good at so many things.
And it's like,
And
okay, well, yes, okay, we get it that Coat is telling this embellished story about himself as Quoth. But even in that embellished story, I also feel like, is he even a Mary Sue in this story? And there's many cases that common criticisms bring up that I'm like, well, they're kind of um, justified because this idea of like so competent or perfect that it appears unrealistic in the
mhm.
setting. I and we can. There's a lot of cases, some stronger than others, and we will probably go through them now. But um, I I feel like he's pretty much cleared on most, if not all, accounts of this idea of like this unrealistic, unearned competency.
I'm with you there, Charles. I have a few examples of places in which he very clearly displays flaws or not being great at things.
Hmm.
I guess we could start by naming the ways in which he does display ridiculous strengths in a lot of areas. Of course, he
Right.
is a legendary figure and all this kind of stuff, so you expect some of that. He, of course, is really, really great as a musician. We also know he does play music a ton and practice and all
Right.
these kind of things,
Let's
but
talk
he
about like
clearly
the
has a
pipes.
gift.
The scene where he
Sure.
earns his pipes is one of the most common, maybe not the most, but it's up there, and it's kind of one of the earlier ones, where he's at the bar and you have to play your song to earn your pipes, and he chooses to play one of the most complicated songs. Didn't really practice that much getting on stage, and of course he plays the most complicated song flawlessly. Everyone in the room tears up, and he earns his pipes that first day, that first time. And people are like, oh, of course, he gets up there and he's the best at everything. But it's like, there's a lot, this idea of, is it unrealistic? Is it unearned that this character would be able to be really good at music at that moment and kind of play from his heart and earn his pipes? This was someone who grew up performing in a performance troupe, right? The Redeemer Rue are performers. Then he had this whole moment where his parents died and he just was in the woods by himself doing nothing but playing the lute over and over. And Rothfuss even writes this moment of like he started to play songs that sounded like the leaves blowing in the wind.
Mhm.
It became a natural extension of his body, of his subconscious mind, of his expression. He was able to express himself through his music flawlessly, and that's because he just was in so much shock from losing his parents that he just practiced nonstop. So it's like
Mhm.
those moments, yeah, even though what he managed to achieve was sensational, of like playing the most difficult song and earning your pipes is kind of a sensational thing, he is the protagonist of a story, and it wasn't totally unearned. He did nothing but practice lute for a long time, and he learned how to make it a part of his self-expression. And for me, that doesn't fall under Mary Sue because we have some competency. It's not that unrealistic that he'd be able to pull this off.
That makes total sense, Charles. Like you're saying, he copes with the trauma of losing his parents by throwing himself completely into his music.
Yes.
And he plays so much that, I mean, especially given his background as someone who already was being trained by the best people you could be trained by to be good at music, then he he becomes ridiculously good at music. And it's almost, I know, Charles, we'll get more into the discussion of how productive Mary Sue is as a conversation topic, right? Certain people are going to be really good at things and are going to have some natural talent at things.
For sure.
Uh, Working hard definitely helps the case. And the combination of those two things is how you expect people to best be able to rise to being elite at something. Like it, Quoth being ridiculously good at music and us being like, well, does that make him a Mary Sue? It's almost like if Michael Jordan were a character in a book, we'd be like, oh my God, like, is this guy a Mary Sue? Like, he's so ridiculously good at basketball. It's like someone's going to be the best at basketball. And it's probably going to
Right.
be someone who, like Michael Jordan, had a lot of natural talent, but also worked ridiculously hard to become
For sure.
really good
And
at
if
the
you're a
thing that he's good
protagonist,
at.
exactly. And if you're going to be the protagonist of a fantasy book, you're going to have some remarkable traits. I
Yes.
think the key thing to think about here is this a trait that should not be possible?
Hmm.
Like, should it not be possible that Kvothe earns his pipes? If he's like, oh, what's a lute? Let me see that. And he like starts plucking and then gets up and plays the most difficult song. It's like, well, okay, that's kind of crazy. But we've had this whole thing about him being a performer and coming from a family of musicians and how music was his only salvation at his lowest lows and how his lute is his most prized possession. And then he gets up and plays and performs and that to me is not impossible for him to have achieved at that time. And that's the distinction for Mary Sue. It's like this, okay, how much is someone like just super capable and competent versus is this something that should not be possible or was this earned in any way? And I think Rothfuss, by writing into his background that this guy is a storyteller and a performer, makes a lot of this stuff like almost brilliant in a way. So I'm all in on this fact that he's in this moment. This is an idea of someone doing something exceptional, but does not qualify for Mary Sue for me.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, Charles. And it sounds like we feel good about
Yep.
the his musical ability. Other things that he's been really good at. One example is his magical ability, right? He seems to have a knack for naming more than most. He also uses sympathy to some pretty impressive
Right.
extents. I'll say, I don't know if this one needs as much conversation as the music, but he does have a similar reason for why he's good at those things, which is he happened to run into his troupe, happened to run into Ben,
Mm-hmm.
who trains him at all this stuff from a very, very young age. And he pretty much has a boost over what most people would get because he had this mentor figure in his life to teach him the basics of these things. And
Yeah. He
I
got a
think
lot of
that,
private lessons. And
yeah.
then I think you also have to ask yourself, again, the context that this is a story being told is like maybe he wasn't as remarkable as we're supposed to believe. Maybe he is. I don't know. But what we do know is that he did get private lessons from Ben when he was a child.
Hmm.
And then he was a good student and performed well at school. The fact that he was the best in his class is not an unrealistic, unearned thing. Like he's getting the lessons, he's at school. You can kind of roll your eyes at like, of course, now he's the best at this, and he's the best at
Hmm.
this, and he's the best at this. But it's like, well, how reliable is this narrator anyway? He's trying to tell his story and make it all about him. So it's more exciting if he's the best. We know he gets beaten a whole lot and he falls from grace multiple times. It's like kind of got to take everything with a grain of salt until we get the truth when this trilogy ends.
For sure. And even given his great magical ability, we still see these instances where he's actually not the best because he gets
Mm.
his butt kicked by Devi.
Yeah.
When he tries to take her, he basically catches her by surprise, and he's got this whole conspiracy in his head of what Davy's done wrong, which she hadn't, but not relevant to this conversation. And despite catching her by surprise, she wrecks him in
Yeah.
a contest of sympathy. So, no
And
one's like,
yeah, for sure. And Patrick does a great job with Quoth's character in this moment and several moments as well. Is like Quoth never really kind of empathizes with the people around him. He's so caught up in his own thing that he's doing that he just assumes that people are just like not living their own lives and doing their own things off on the sidelines when he's not interacting with them. It's like I interact with you and then you basically like just sit in a corner until I interact with you again. It's like no, these people do stuff and have things going on and are training and are doing whatever, and that gets him in trouble with authority all the time. He has no sense of how people perceive him, and that's something that someone with too much confidence would get himself wrapped into, and it's all totally believable. Yeah, if you're someone who's like super confident and also super young and you're performing well at school and you're beating all your classmates in sympathy, it seems to reason that you can go on and take on Devi. And then Devi just smokes you. So as the reader, we're reading up until this point and being like, oh, he's such a Mary Sue. But it's like, he's got an inflated ego and he's telling his own story about how good he was. And then we kind of glance over the moment he wasn't good, So it's like, these things we have to think about. He's presented as being super competent, but he's also a sensationalized character. He's young, yet all these things that are getting wrapped into it. The context clues are that, like you said, Dylan, he gets wrecked by Devi, and these things where his run-ins with authority or people outside of his peer group, he gets reminded of this time and time again, but he fails to learn the lesson. So it's like it's wrapped into his strengths are so well paired with his flaws that this is the character of Kvothe, and you're supposed to not like him a little bit for how sensationalized his skills are, and that's kind of built into his character. It's a brilliant, brilliant character that Rothfuss commits to and doesn't give us another perspective to remind us like, oh, he's kind of a brat and he's kind of insufferable. It's like we never get that told to us. We get shown it over and over, but it's not in an obvious way. Rothfuss's commitment to telling the story through Kvothe's lens is what makes us sometimes forget the nuances going on in this, and I can't repeat that enough. I feel like it's the second time I've said it, but it's true.
Well, we do get that moment with, I believe it's with Sim, where he's like, hey, dude, after this trial, you need to get out of here because things that are going on with you are too controversial right now. No one wants to see you around here. And Kvothe, because of that solipsistic nature that you were getting at there, Charles, he basically can't see outside himself.
That was like news to him.
Yeah, in a way.
I never thought of that.
Other people have strong opinions about whether I should be here or not after the giant debacle that was that trial that was in everyone's in the public eye, and he's so attached to his own perspective, and so are we as readers, that sometimes we lose sight of Kvothe's flaws because he's losing sight of them. And I think we still do get these moments, like you're saying, context clues, where someone like Sim will mention that, or even just things like similar to him getting his butt kicked by Devi, is that while he does take quickly to fighting and all this kind of stuff, he gets his butt kicked too by a 10-year-old girl over and over again.
And when he's learning the Lethani, he fails constantly, gets his butt kicked by the 10-year-old over and over, and he has fears of getting his hands hurt. And that's what leads us to this beautiful, almost picturesque, hint hint, story tale moment where he passes the trial and makes his hands bleed symbolically that he's all in on the Lethani. And it's a great moment, and it's all realistic and built up and paid off. It's like, to say Kvothe is a Mary Sue, like, he's the only Mary Sue I know that gets pummeled by a little girl over and over again consistently.
That's very true, Charles. I think that we probably can't have a discussion about Kvothe as potentially a Mary Sue without talking about Felurian and how pretty much following his romp in the Fae with Felurian, he is perceived as very desirable by pretty much every woman that he comes into contact with. Charles, any thoughts on...
Oh, you're turning it to me now? Yeah, there's a theme that runs through the latter half of the second book, the idea of like recreational kind of relations that a lot of fans kind of aren't necessarily on board with. Probably me included with that. It's not something I really enjoy talking about that much, but I will say that that's one of the more damning things, because this is something that he went into totally blind, I'll say, and then all of a sudden he impresses the romance creature with his romance, and you're like, okay, but you have to also think that's a pivotal moment in the storytelling. He starts to adopt these mythical he gets a mythical cloak. He like this tone of the story kind of changes, and he was trained by the Fae, right? So he picked up some lessons, and he picked up some like magical things. I don't know how much it's magical as much as it is like he's been kind of changed by his time in the Fae. It makes him a little otherworldly, kind of. So when he comes back into the world of the living, he is kind of changed, and he has some funky things going on with him, and that's for multiple reasons beyond just the Fae. There's the Kvothe and all this other stuff too that he's interacted with in this world, and who knows how much it's altered him. But that's all kind of in context, and I don't know. I turn it back to you, man. For me, it's like it is what it is. But I feel like, he's, again, Kvothe has never been able to perceive what others think of him, and that comes to women also. And we've even had in these earlier moments where he's like, oh, that woman was kind of interested in me, and I blew it by not recognizing it until way too late. And then now he has more confidence in that area, and he's starting to pick up on it, and do his thing more. It's kind of earned in that way. And then I go back to this constantly, this idea of this is a story being told, and it is kind of sensationalized. But I don't know. Is it unearned? Is it unrealistic? The guy has a shade cloak and can play lute really well and well educated. Like, it's kind of eye-rolly, but it's not Mary Sue-y. There is that self-insertion piece, though, you could say.
Well, yeah, we don't know what's going on or not going on there, but I'll agree with you that the most damning, as you say, element of the whole shtick here is the fact that he is basically a virgin, and then he has this sexual interaction. I'm trying to keep my our clean ratings as much as possible. He has this interaction with the Fae, and she's with Florin, and she's very, very impressed, and doesn't believe him that it was his first time. If we take that if we take that as just true without a grain of salt because of the unreliable narrator piece of Kvothe telling his story, then I think that feels pretty Mary Sue-esque. Right. I don't know if that means he's necessarily a Mary Sue, but depending on how you define Mary Sue, and there's many ways to do that, maybe you feel that way.
And look, we said there's a strong case to be made that he is, and this is a piece that's a strong part of it. But yeah, I always come back to it is a story of an exceptional guy who goes into myth status. So it's this whole somehow just stumbled into this magical setting and did some kind of crazy thing for a little while, and then coming back to reality is part of that mythical nature of it. So
for sure. Not my favorite part of the... I love Kingkiller, as we all know. Not my favorite part of the series for sure, and maybe the most... the strongest case comes from some of these aspects. But despite the fact that just about every woman that Kvothe interacts with is interested in him, we do have the element of Denna, who Kvothe, she definitely seems
gone a long way without mentioning Denna for a Kingkiller episode.
Yeah. Yeah, that was shockingly long, but I can't help myself. And I think this is a key part of the Kvothe Mary Sue conversation, because people actually use Denna as an example I've seen to say why Kvothe is a Mary Sue. People saying things, well, of course, his love interest is the most beautiful, most amazing, most all of these things that Denna is described as by Kvothe, but not necessarily by the other characters, including Bast, who has seen her and mentions she had a crooked nose.
She has a crooked nose. That is fact that we know. One of the few pieces of real fact from the present day Kingkiller that we know to be true that contradicts the flawless description of her in the actual story told by Kvothe. So Rothfuss is, for the way I see it, is a context clue of hey, if this is a sign of what else he could be capable of telling the story, you know? Great point.
Yes. If we took it at face value that everything
I see what
Kvothe
you did there.
says at nose value, we don't want to cut off our nose to spite our faces when it comes to Kvothe as an unreliable narrator here.
That's true.
So you get to hear that Kvothe thinks of Denna in this extremely perfect light, which makes sense with everything we come to know. But we also pretty immediately get the context that the one other person who can speak to this is like, wait, are you kidding me? Like, this is not how I think of the person that you're talking about, and I've seen her. And I think, as you said, Charles, that's a great sign that Kvothe is capable of embellishing a lot of his story, and that he, even if he's not doing it intentionally, he just only has his one perspective. I think he is doing it intentionally, for the record, but he only has his one perspective, and in his perspective, Denna is just about perfect. And it's not surprising that then she's described that way, and I think it is relevant that she's described that way to Kvothe and his character. And even if she was perfect, Charles, which we don't think she is, then it's still not this thing where, and Kvothe, quote unquote, gets the girl, and she is perfect in every way. It's that Kvothe just can't put it together with her. Like, they just can't figure out what's going on between them in a way that works. And we know from the Frame story that, barring some big reveal, these two don't end up together. And it's pretty sad, I think, but it's similar to the same stuff we were talking about with the bigger they are, the harder they fall, right? Like, he had an opportunity to be with what who he perceives as the perfect woman, and he can't make it happen, and that's tragic.
For sure. And I think that also weaves in, like, for how exceptional he is, and he even is able to get the attention of Denna. Rothfuss always balances it with the flaws in Kvothe's character, and that he can't see what Denna, like, anything that's about himself, he's just so blind to any perspective other than his own. And he's so unsure about how Denna feels, even though everyone around him is beyond frustrated with the situation. He can't seem to see it, and that happens constantly. He'll see it in other people's relationships, like, oh, why don't they get together already? And it's like, are you kidding me, Kvothe? Like, you and Denna are the prime example of what this is. So even in these moments that you can roll your eyes at and be like, oh, of course, here comes the love interest, it's like Rothfuss purposely puts that in and balances it against the trope where it's like they can't get together. She's not as perfect as we think. She might not be as perfect as we think she is. Like, she's going off doing adventures, and so when they connect, who knows what's happened in her world? Like, Kvothe doesn't even think about it, but I mean, she lives a whole life. So something's going on. And the fact that they are never able to express their feelings for each other and get together is a central part of that. And Kvothe is like ignoring maybe some potential signs from Denna of like what's going on in her life that he's kind of clueless to, and it's all blended together really well in the character of Kvothe. And I think that this part of it, of being this attractive guy or maybe getting attention from Denna from the beginning, is an important piece to that. And for me, there's no way in which that is unrealistic or not possible. Like, they met by chance and they have run into each other, and it might not even be by chance that they're running into each other anymore, right? So all of these mysteries and things are well woven into the narrative that we have to consider, and the tropes that are being subverted, and the character that Rothfuss is building. It all is so masterful and understated, and I feel like it gets kind of lost when you just see two characters meet and immediately get attracted to each other. You're like, I've seen this before. It's ridiculous. But it's like, think about the context in which it's being done. It's actually rather interesting. It's like, we'll see where it goes too. So it's just the Denna relationship is one of those things that's like, it's the whole mystery of this book is what Denna's up to, and we'll see.
For sure, Charles. And I think putting a bow on the Denna part of this conversation is I think if Quoth were Mary Sue, Denna probably him and Denna would have gotten together by this point,
Denna would have
right?
professed her love
Denna
for
would
him,
have
said a
been,
bunch of
yeah,
nice things about him, like, "Oh, Quoth, you're the best at playing lute."
yeah,
It's like, but that has not happened.
yeah. It's
And there's a
it,
whole nother conversation to be had about the Denna and Quoth relationship and the criticisms that pop up from that, as we both
for
know
sure.
in our Kingkiller episodes. But in the context of Mary Sue-ism, there's better cases to be made in the book than the Denna Quoth relationship.
Charles, are you teasing my episode idea of the good, the bad, and the crooked, an analysis of the Quoth and Denna relationship?
Yeah, and we've also, had the conversation a couple times in our buddy read episodes, and we even had this conversation about this Quoth and Mary Sue in our buddy read episodes. And I went back and listened. I was kind of light on my stance. And when I was first talking about it, I'm like, he could be perceived as one. I kind of get it. And now I'm kind of more on, like, now that I've read more of Kingkiller and sat with it for longer, I'm like, I get the criticism and there's plenty of good cases to be made for it, but I'm wholeheartedly convinced that this is something else is going on here. And it's this trope of this protagonist and this exceptional hero. Like, Rothfuss is weaving in so many, like, cautionary flaws that go in hand with that kind of character, and he's built it up in terms of how it's being told that the other shoe's gonna drop for Quoth, and this is all building up to it, and I'm just so interested to see how this goes. It's been so well constructed to this point. I would never, like, Mary Sue would have never crossed my mind, honestly, if it wasn't for the online forums.
Well, you make some interesting points there, Charles, and I think we're on a pretty similar page here, as we often are on the FDF podcast. There's a reason we're lifelong friends.
Yeah.
And I think that something that came up for me in my research that I want to mention before we finish up here is I was like, okay, well, why, when me and Charles keep talking about this and we're not thinking he's a Mary Sue, why is this such a common thing that comes up? And I think it's because the term is marked by so many different definitions. So we tried to give ours at the front and we tried to analyze it through that lens. But if you have a different definition of Mary Sue, it's not surprising at all that you come to different conclusions about whether Quoth is one or not. And among the there are many different interpretations of what a Mary Sue is that are presented on TV tropes, and I recommend checking out that page. But one of the things that's described on that page is the prototypical Mary Sue is an original female character in a fanfic who obviously serves as an idealized version of the author, mainly for the purpose of wish fulfillment. She's exotically beautiful, often having an unusual hair or eye color, and has a similarly cool and exotic name. She's exceptionally talented in an implausibly wide variety of areas and may possess skills that are rare or non-existent in the canon setting. She also lacks any realistic or at least story-relevant character flaws. Either that or her flaws are obviously meant to be endearing. And I think if you're coming in with a lot of those connotations, it's hard not to pretty quickly
Quoth checks a lot of those boxes,
Yeah,
but not all of them, and not the important ones. The improbable aspect of it, and like the sneaky ones that Rothfuss purposely did not check. I think when crafting Quoth.
I think so too. And
I think we're supposed
characters...
to not like him to a certain extent, right? He's supposed to be this kind of overcompetent, seemingly perfect guy.
Yeah, and I think, though this probably wasn't the intention at the time, in some ways it feels like Quoth is not necessarily a subversion of the Mary Sue, but toying with the idea of these legendary characters and the idea of telling stories about legendary characters who really, it's later on that the term Mary Sue really got popularized outside of fanfic circles. But looking back, it feels like Quoth is, I wouldn't say subversion, but a character that Rothfuss toys with the idea of Mary Sue's and mythical legendary figures. And because he is meant to be someone where that's toyed with, he has to represent at least some of these characteristics for it to be interesting or compelling.
Mm.
So I think, yeah, if your definition of Mary Sue has a lot of these like exotically beautiful with the weird hair color, right? It's fire red. It's not just a red hair the way we know it. It's fire red.
It's definitely
Kvothe.
like a noticeable, unique thing.
Yes, and has cooler exotic name, like something where the first two letters are K and V, and it's like, how do I pronounce this? Like those kind of things, of course, are present with Kvothe, and I think it's intentional. And like you said, Charles, doesn't hit all of the things I mentioned in that definition, but it's hard not to almost think of Kvothe when you're hearing that. So we understand why this is a criticism leveled a lot.
There's a valid argument to be made there that he is, and that, like we said at the beginning, it's just we're more interested in what boxes have not been checked and what are his flaws as a character that complement the ones that are checked, and like the context of the whole frame story, and these more subtle, nuanced things that we're super interested in, that we're willing to give Kvothe the benefit of the doubt until we wait and see what Doors of Stone has in store for us.
Well said, Charles. And I think this is a conversation that really does make me excited to have that. Yeah. How productive is the term Mary Sue type conversation? Because I think it's in some ways a criticism that doesn't really give us the chance with Kvothe to get into the depth of what makes him such a compelling character.
And it has a very negative connotation as a term also, which I'm not crazy about, because even if he is a lot of these things, that doesn't necessarily mean we have to be like put him down and like dismiss the character and be like, oh, 1 star off my my rating because of this. It's like, and we'll get more into that in a couple days. But it does make me excited to have that conversation, because it's interesting the trajectory that Mary Sue has had in like online forums and book reviews and things, and what it means or doesn't mean, and we'll get more into that. But I thought it was, we both thought it would have been fun to talk about it in terms of Kingkiller and in terms of Kvothe, because he is a more contemporary example and a more contested example for a lot of people online, and we had very strong opinions about Kvothe as well that we could not contain in an episode that also dealt with the phrase Mary Sue at large. So it's like, we'll have this conversation, get ourselves ramped up to have the bigger conversation in a few days. But I'm glad we did this, and if you guys at home agree or disagree, let us know, because we're interested. We like having this conversation.
Yeah, just because Charles and I agree a lot more along these lines of Kvothe isn't a Mary Sue doesn't mean that we aren't open to hearing from y'all about reasons why you think he is, or other reasons why he isn't. I don't care. I just want to hear from y'all. I love engaging with the fans.
We just like having the conversation. We're not here to argue. We're here to like be enthusiasts about Kingkiller. We want to talk more about the flaws in Kvothe's character and if he is or is not a Mary Sue and all that. We shared our piece, and now we want to hear yours.
Nailed it, Charles. Should we get that outro music pumping, and I'll tell them where they can find us on social media and beyond?
Absolutely. Ask and you shall receive. Here we go.
All right. Well, you can find us on Gmail if you want to send us an email at theftfpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook or Instagram at the FTF Podcast. You can find us on Twitter, which I say is probably the best place to reach out to us, at the FTF Podcast 1. That's with the number 1 at the end. If you just... Oh, also... theftfpodcast.com. You can find our website. And if you just Google Friends Talking Fantasy these days. Apparently we're coming up, which Charles and I never thought was going to be a thing.
We thought we would just be competing with fantasy football for the rest of our days.
Yeah.
But thanks to you, the friends, that's no longer the case.
Yeah.
You just Google Friends Talking Fantasy.
And given my track record competing at fantasy football, it probably would not go well for us.
Dylan's search history is probably working against us because he's such a fantasy football fan.
Yes, but also not as often the winner as I'd like to be. So if it's me and fantasy football, I don't expect wins, but we're doing okay.
We're doing okay. And thank you for finding us and for joining the discourse, and thank you for listening. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.